You're listening to Odyssey, A Tale from the Road, an audiobook by Christopher Cologne. All rights reserved. Any resemblance to persons living or dead are purely coincidental.
Chapter 16. Not too far from where the catering truck stopped, a small town in the distance. Without even conferring with each other, we all started walking in that direction. Once again we didn't talk, but we were all in a bit of a daze from our latest escape from death's clutches. For as much bad luck as I was having with all these psychos we were meeting on the road, we were just escaping by the skin of our teeth, except for Raphael. I really needed to do something about that when we got to Ithaca. The town had been a real shithole. I was so let down. We came all this way looking for civilization, and came across this pathetic excuse for a community. The place looked depressed. I hope there was no children being raised in void like this, for their own sake. The town looked like it was prosperous about 50 years ago and then was frozen in time. Only it wasn't frozen, it just started to rot and slowly die, and this is what was left. A mockery of a town. A farce. The architecture only stood because a strong enough wind hadn't come around to knock it all down. Boarded up businesses, shattered windows, neglected trash collected in the streets. We had come looking for help and it seemed we would have to continue to look further. I told the guys maybe if we split up, we could cover more ground. This town couldn't be completely empty. I was scared to see who would continue to live in a place like this. Obviously someone down on their luck, like us, except they just gave up and settled to stay in this sorrowful mess of a town. Since Corey and I weren't on speaking terms, I suggested that I go with Jimmy in one direction and Dimitri and Corey could go in the other. We would meet back here in an hour or so and see if we could find somebody, anybody, sympathetic to our dilemma. I highly doubt anybody would help us. If they could help us get out of town, they would have helped themselves a long time ago. I really didn't want to meet the broken soul that would consider this place home. But desperate times called for desperate measures, so we split up and went to go salvage some humanity in this burnt-out husk of a town. It was good to walk and talk with Jimmy. It really boosted my spirits. When we were alone, he opened up. He learned a long time ago that when he was in the presence of Corey, it was best to keep his mouth shut. So he adopted a speak only when spoken to attitude. He said it helped him keep his sanity when dealing with our delightful lead singer. Jim liked being off of the radar, unlike the way Corey and I were constantly butting heads. Jim didn't like confrontation, and Corey wouldn't listen to reason when he was all charged up. When Jim and I got to one street corner of the town, we saw our first sign of life. It was a USPS truck and it was parked right in front of the storefront that had been the town's post office. Usually in a bigger town, a small storefront like this would serve as an auxiliary annex to the main post office, but in such an unpopulated place like this town, this was the main office. As far as government jobs go, this had to be a pretty decent gig. There was no way a mail carrier could be burdened in an underpopulated place like this. Meanwhile you're still collecting the same paycheck as your peers in a big city, who are obviously overworked. Every now and then, a postal worker gets so stressed out, they go on a shooting spree. That couldn't be the case in a tiny town like this. Working for the government isn't that bad sometimes. Just as I expected, there was only one person that worked in the post office. He did everything there. He sorted the mail, delivered it, and when wasn't doing that, he sat around and waited for whatever few citizens to come in and buy stamps or send out whatever packages. But that was so rare, he was basically being paid to hang around and do nothing. I tell you, if I wasn't so adamant on following my dreams of being a musician, I would definitely have a government job. I was expecting someone much older, but he was closer to our age, in his late 20s or early 30s. He didn't look like your cookie-cutter civil servant. He had long hair and wore his Nike sneakers. I'm no stickler for regulations, but I'm sure that was against some sort of dress code. But working all the way out here, there was nobody there to supervise him. So, he stretched the rules a little bit, who cares, he did his job and he did it with enthusiasm. His spirit hadn't been crushed, like so many other people in his position, by micromanaging supervisors or incompetent bosses. He knew his duties and fulfilled them to the T, with a zest for life that was extremely rare in his field. I was surprised, he was so positive, even for a citizen of this dreary town. The cost of living in this area had to be dirt cheap, so his meager government wages stretched a hell of a lot further than his neighbors. I would be in a constant good mood also. I couldn't put my finger on it, but he looked familiar. Something about his height and in his face, I had to shake off that eerie feeling of familiarity. When Jim and I walked into the post office, he looked glad to see us, almost like he was expecting us. That was a little weird. Maybe he was just lonely in his job and was just happy to see faces of people he could talk to. I had explained to him our whole story, up to this point, from Gabby all the way up to Beatrice. He wasn't surprised or shocked by any parts of the story. I had this feeling that he wasn't going to be. I felt at ease telling him the truth, because it seemed like he already knew all of our exploits. I spoke to him like an old friend, as if we knew him our whole lives. Jim was also comfortable with the postman, so it wasn't just my naive misgivings. His name was Steven. The postman told us what happened to this town and why now it was so desolated. At one point, it has been a prison town. Towns all the way out here had no real economy. If you weren't a farmer or lumberjack, you lived in poverty. In a move that killed two birds with one stone, the government had built a prison on the edge of town. It brought stable income to the townspeople, and businesses benefited from the blossoming economy. People usually didn't like it when a prison was being built near their homes, but in an economically depressed area like this, it was welcomed with open arms. The government had a place to house its violent criminals. There was a small problem. About 70% of the prison population came from New York City. The prison itself had been filled minorities from the metropolitan area. The local guards who worked in the prison were exclusively white, and weren't used to dealing with blacks and Hispanics. It was the sad truth that in small towns like this, racism was not only tolerated, but was accepted. 50 years ago, it would be no surprise to see signs posted up in local shops that read, "When the sun goes down, I better not see your black ass around." Or if a minority did seem to make his way into town, people wouldn't even bat an eyelash if somebody yelled from their car window, "Nigger, go home." The townspeople lived behind the times. Before the prison, they only saw minorities on television or in the newspaper, not in real life. It was unusual that the prison itself was accepted, but its inmates were vilified, not for their crimes but for the color of their skin. The guards gave in to their racist attitudes and abuse ran rampant through the prison. There were assaults and several cases of neglect. It was the guards' job to give basic care to the inmates, along with custody and control, and they didn't do their job. After several lawsuits over the controversial treatment of the inmates, the government shut down the prison. There was too many instances of negligence and maltreatment for the supervisors to cover up anymore. As the prison went belly up, the town withered around it. The townspeople could only blame themselves. Their inability to adapt to the changing world had left them without a source of income. They had bit the hand that fed them. It was a ghost town now, still paying for its sins. That was a long time ago, before Postman Steven was born. He was like us, raised in a world that was a bit more open-minded than our parents. There was still racism out there, especially in little backwoods areas like this. But our generation had been raised in the age of cable television and the internet, so we're made better aware of the effects of racism and bias crimes. In other parts of the world, genocide over ethnic background was still waging on, and we have witnessed its crippling effects. By the time we have children, hopefully we could show them the right way, before we wipe ourselves off the face of the planet. Let me get down from my soapbox. Around the time the Steven finished his story, I realized it was time to go back and meet with Corey and Dimitri. The postman said he would drive us over, in the government truck. He was about to start his rounds of deliveries, anyway. So he wasn't totally violating regulations when he volunteered to drop us off. It must have been so great to work without a supervisor looming over your shoulder. When we got to the rendezvous point, it was just Corey standing there. He had a panicked look on his face and was breathing heavy. His shirt was drenched in sweat, from running over to the spot where we planned to meet. "Corey. Where's Dimitri?" I dropped whatever grudge I had been holding onto. This was serious. Corey was still panting out of breath. "She got him. I knew something was wrong. I got away." "What the hell are you talking about? Who are you talking about? Who is she?" I asked. Corey took a deep breath and gulped down hard. He continued, "When we split up, Dimitri and went up that street. We didn't see anybody for a while. Then we heard singing. This woman was singing as she walked down the street. She was carrying clothes home from the laundromat. Her voice was beautiful, it was enchanting. Dimitri and I decided to go over and talk to her and see if maybe she could help us. I asked if she needed help with her clothes, you know, to break the ice. She was pretty too, so it seemed like a good idea at the time. Boy, was I wrong. She invited us up to her apartment. I should have known that it was a bad idea. It can't be good, when a woman, who just met two strange men, invites them up to her house. But I wasn't thinking with the right head. I thought maybe she was just some kind of freaky chick who was into that sort of thing, so I didn't question it. When we got up to the apartment, it was confirmed that she was a freak. She had all types of devices and harnesses, like a sex dungeon. Everything was made of steel and leather. Things bolted to the walls, things hanging from the ceiling, and tables that you could strap people to. It was wild. She said that she was a professional dominatrix, and that was the studio she worked out of and lived in. Things took a turn for the worse, when I insulted her beliefs. She had said that she was a vegan and didn't eat meat. And I called her a hypocrite because all of the leather products in her studio were made from the very animals she was trying to save from not eating meat. She said it was cruel for animals to be used for food, and I pointed out that God only knows how many cows were slaughtered for all of her harnesses. That's when she lost it. Corey took a deep breath. We all hung on his every word.
Please visit twostrangersonePodcast.net.